Hey, it's Mark Bergin from the Browns Nation Station. The listeners of the Browns Nation Station can show their Browns Nation pride by going to brownsnationswag.com. The site has all the latest and best fan gear to represent your team. Again, that's brownsnationswag.com. And if you're watching the Browns Nation Station on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe to the show so you don't miss another episode. All right, cue the music. It's time to start the show. Welcome to the Browns Nation Station. I'm your host, Mark Bergin, recording today with fellow BrownsNation.com writer Pat Opperman. And Pat, we are recording this after the Browns' 23-16 loss to the New York Jets. And this loss especially stung considering that the Pittsburgh Steelers beat the Colts to win the AFC North division. But had the Browns won today, they would be in the playoffs for the first time since 2002. But just your initial thoughts, Pat, after today's loss to the Jets.
Well, obviously, disappointment is the number one thing. I mean, the Browns faced a lot of crazy things happening during the week. With lost Hubbard right away, then they had Wills not practicing, then he ended up not playing in the game, and then the whole COVID list deal going on. And I expected them to come out more excited, more determined to get past that, and with a little more energy than they did. I'm not sure that Stefanski handled it well. I mean, he was telling the broadcasters before the game that he changed a huge chunk of the game plan with the new receivers to try to make it simpler, I guess. And I'm wondering if he really had to do that, if he could have just kept the same game plan and made more use of the second and third targets, which would be Hunt and Chubb and tight ends and so on and so forth. It just looked like there was some confusion, and the offensive line, struggled a bit, and Mayfield was under more pressure than he usually is. But I just watching the game, it just didn't seem like, not that they weren't trying, of course, but I expected them to come out really and punching the Jets in the mouth, and they just did not do it.
Let me break down the playoff picture for the Browns, and then we'll get into this afternoon's game against the Jets. So at the time of this recording, Pat, the Browns still have about a 62% chance to make the playoffs. The Browns, at the time of this recording, are the 7th seed in the AFC. Now, here's what would need to happen for the Browns to make the playoffs. They can get in if they beat the Steelers in Week 17, or if the Colts lose in their matchup in Week 17. The Colts play the Jaguars, so who knows how likely that will be. I would not expect that to happen. The Browns can still get in the playoffs if the Titans lose their final 2 games. The Titans play the Packers tonight on Sunday Night Football, and then in Week 17 against the Houston Texans. So there's your playoff picture for the Browns. But this was a great opportunity for Cleveland today, because this game might go down as one of those games Browns fans remember. You had the drive way back in the day, the fumble. You might say the fumble 2.0 or the coronavirus game because of Mayfield's fumble late in the game, giving the ball. Again, they recovered it, but they weren't able to advance the ball, which is what the rule is. So I actually thought the referees did a good job there. But Browns fans are going to be shaking their head. You've got Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, and not giving either of them the ball in that 4th and 1 situation. I know that the QB sneak had worked several times previously in the game, but going back to what you said about Stefanski, Pat, my gripe is this. You're down your top 4 receivers today in Jarvis Landry, who missed the first game in his 7-year career today, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Rashard Higgins, Kaderil Hodge, Odell Beckham Jr. has been out since October. You're missing all of your top receivers today. And Baker Mayfield throws the ball 53 times, and you only run the ball 18 times. I know the Browns were facing a deficit and they didn't have the clock to work with, but if you're down your top 4 or 5 receivers, that is my biggest criticism of Kevin Stefanski and this Cleveland Browns offense is why are you putting your quarterback in that situation? I understand you have a plethora of tight ends, but I would have liked to see the Browns run the ball a lot more, and they were not effective at all on the ground. 18 rushes for 45 yards. And I thought that was a huge, the line of scrimmage really told the story this afternoon.
That's the second week in a row that the running game kind of fell short. Even against the Giants, they didn't really do that well. I think it was 3.1 yards per carry for Chubb and Hunt. And I think Stefanski let the early results get to him, and that's kind of silly when you know that Chubb gets stronger as he goes along. He owns the 4th quarter, and it's great to say, well, they can't run because they're behind, but you're looking at guys that get 5, 6, 7, 8 yards a carry sometimes, and you probably could have. You probably could have kept running and kept with the same basic game plan. The Jets, I mean, to their credit, they came out the excited team. Like, they smelled blood right from the start. Cleveland, I wrote earlier that, my keys to the game, the Jets came into this game having scored on their first opening drive 8 games in a row. That was the most in the league this year. And I said, one way to show the Jets who's boss would be to stop them on the first drive right from the get-go. Well, Cleveland did that. They shut them back, and then they forgot to do that for the rest of the drives after that. Jets scored on the next 2 drives, and the game was certainly not lost, but the tone of the game changed dramatically. And I just don't know. I think that Stefanski, again, he falls behind and he kind of loses his imagination a little bit sometimes. There was no reverses, no end arounds. I mean, he had some fast guys. Yeah, they're new receivers, but those guys are fast. The guys that came up from the practice squad, just hand the ball off to them. Let them pull a Jarvis on you. Maybe they can't throw, but they can run. And there was just nothing to make the Jets worry about anything outside the front seven. And I think that hurt the whole game plan overall. I also thought Mayfield spent way too much time in the pocket today with missing 2 offensive linemen. And I expected him to be rolling out all day long, and it just wasn't happening. So I pinned this loss on Stefanski. I think for 2 things: the game plan, and because the team wasn't excited. I think that was a reflection of the coach. I think it was a little bit of deer in headlights looks.
Jedrick Wills out, the starting left tackle, rookie, hadn't missed a start yet this season. Kendall Lamb fills in from him because, remember, Chris Hubbard, you mentioned, Pat, had the season-ending knee injury a week ago, filling in for Wyatt Teller at the right guard position. Rookie Nick Harris makes his first NFL start at the right guard position for the Browns. So not just without all the receivers, but 2 of your 5 offensive linemen out in this one. And this, to me, the Jets just dominated the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball in this one. And the Browns dug themselves too deep a deficit to be able to overcome in the end. And I think that's why Cleveland got away from its running game in this one. And entering this week, this was something where the Browns had the 3rd best rushing attack in the NFL, and Stefanski was actually the favorite to win Coach of the Year headed into Week 16. I can't imagine he'll still be the favorite after Week 16 because, again, depending on whether the Browns make the playoffs or not, the 10 wins is really nice. But if you're talking about a 2007 scenario for the Browns where they get 10 wins and don't make the playoffs, this season will be a failure.
Yeah, I don't agree with you on that, Mark. I think that going into the season, a lot of us, including one particularly excellent writer, had said 10 wins and no playoffs is the likely outcome. We did not think that 10 wins would be enough, but we were kind of hopeful that 10 wins would work for the Browns. But a lot of people said 8 to 9 wins. I thought I was more optimistic than a lot of other prognosticators when I said 10. And I said I would predict that there will be about 4 or 5 teams with 10 wins that will be battling for 2 or 3 of the last playoff spots. I think when they added the 7th team, a lot of people got their hopes up for the Browns. But 10 wins and just outside or just inside one spot or the other is pretty much exactly what we were talking about in early September before the first kickoff. So, but they got our hopes up along the way. So yeah, it's a disappointment now. But I think when you look back in February and say, well, overall, first year coach, COVID, everything else going on, it's progress. And that was really what we were looking for this year.
I'm going to counter with this, though, Pat. With the expanded playoff format with 7 teams per conference, in a normal season, if only 6 teams were getting in, I would agree with you. But with the expanded playoff format, you would think that 10 wins would do it. But the Browns have their work cut out for them in Week 17 because if they beat the Steelers, they have something like a 99% chance of making the playoffs. So if they beat the Steelers, there are some crazy odds to where if the Browns did go 11-5, that they might not make the playoffs, but that is less than 1% chance. So it's essentially, you still control your own fate against Pittsburgh. And it's going to be interesting to see if the Steelers play their starters in Week 17 because they have now clinched the AFC North. I mean, other than playoff positioning, now remember, Kansas City got the AFC 1 seed. So the Chiefs are going to be the only team that get a first round bye, which again goes back to that differing playoff scenario. This is a different playoff format than we've seen in previous seasons.
Yeah, I fully expect Pittsburgh, just based on their history, to rest starters. I think that we may see our favorite backup quarterback and a lot of, Snell instead of Connor. And I fully expect that just based on Tomlin's history. And I think that kind of plays into our needs that we need to win. It also puts a lot more pressure on Stefanski and Mayfield, because if Pittsburgh plays their second string and we still don't beat them, that's just going to be like that would be the most disappointing part of the year. But yeah, there is a scenario, like you said, there is a scenario with 11 wins that Cleveland does not make the playoffs. There would have to be 4 teams at 11-5, which is possible. Miami would sneak in there. Their win over the Raiders, I believe, gives them the edge in common opponents or division people. I'm not sure. But in a 4-way tie, the Browns are knocked out first, the way that works. So that's your 1% chance that if everybody winds up 11-5, we're beat. But again, other than that, if one team loses, Tennessee loses tonight, I think it's over, because right? No, it's not quite over. No, it's not quite over yet. But they would have 5 losses also. But there's multiple scenarios. If this team wins, among the 4 teams, depending on who wins out, Miami probably facing a Bills team resting starters also next week, and they're playing. They're really playing well, and they have the number 1 defense. That surprised me when I saw that. And it's really going to go down to Tennessee and Indianapolis. One of those teams really has to lose next week, and that would make everything so much simpler for us. And then we're done.
I hear you. And that was something going into today's game where, again, I was flipping back and forth between the Browns-Jets game and then the Steelers-Colts game. And you don't want to see your division opponent clinch the division. But in this case, in helping the Browns make the playoffs, had they won today, they'd be in the playoffs for the first time since 2002. So once the Steelers, they had a miraculous comeback because they were facing a huge deficit. I'm flipping back and forth between games, and it was just like my anxiety. We were messaging before the pod, Pat, about, okay, now that the Browns have lost, what are the scenarios, and trying to sort all this out to the listeners of the Browns Nation station. And so just a wild day. I mean, you enter into today's game with a bunch of guys elevated from the practice squad. And they had this graphic during the broadcast, and I put it in the show notes, of Marvin Hall, who had 686 offensive snaps in his career. Derek Willis and Jamarcus Bradley. Willis only had 30 snaps and Bradley had 15 entering today's game. I thought Mayfield had a little bit of connection with Bradley in this one, but that was one of the big questions I had coming in was, okay, with all the players that are out for the Browns, who's going to step up, especially from the offensive side of the ball, because the contact tracing related to COVID-19 put more offensive players out than defensive players out. Now, they were still without B.J. Goodson, Jacob Phillips, 2 linebackers as well. But the Browns, you could argue, were in a situation similar to what the Broncos were several weeks back, when the Broncos didn't have a starting quarterback and they had to elevate a receiver from the practice squad. It was a pretty similar situation what the Browns faced today. And kind of where my brain goes with this, Pat, is what if what happens to the Browns today happens to a team in the playoffs when they're at a complete competitive disadvantage? I know the Browns they closed at a 6.5-point favorite entering today's game over the Jets, but you knew last night when you found out that all the receivers were going to miss time. Then you find out this morning that Jedrick Wills is going to be out with an illness. You knew this was going to be a tough go for Cleveland this afternoon, but that's kind of where my brain goes with all this, is what happens when this happens to a team in the playoffs, especially if it's a contender. Say it's like, I don't know, say Kansas City or say that New Orleans or the Buffalo Bills, what have you.
Yeah, that's why earlier in the year, they discussed the possibility of putting the playoff teams into pods, that they were going to isolate them in one spot, play all the games at one stadium, forget about the home field advantage, which there isn't really one anyway without fans in most of the stadiums. But they decided against it. They said, now we'll roll the dice. We have our super duper stringent anti-COVID plan, and then you got 7 Browns or 6 Browns on the COVID list in 1 week. And timing is everything. I mean, if I'm a team manager, I'm doing it anyway. My team's going to be in that hotel with room service, and we're testing every waiter and front desk clerk in that hotel every 2 hours to make sure it doesn't happen again. Because if it happens the day before the game, there is just no scenario in which those players are going to get back. And I don't see, there are contingencies for Monday night games if need be. They can push a game back a day, but the whole point of the playoffs is nobody has that disadvantage of a short week or a long week or advantage of a long week. And so that kind of messes with that thing. Somebody's going to be messed up. I think back to what they did with the Ravens when the Ravens were so badly off. And, that's why the Browns are complaining today. Browns fans are complaining, and that's why Denver fans were complaining. Look what you did for the Ravens, and you made us play a game, And I think what happened with the Ravens, that was such a disaster and led to so many problems that they said, okay, you know what? From now on, we're just playing the darn game. So, yeah, it's a risk, but it'll have to happen. It'll be interesting to see Super Bowl week with all the events. There won't be any players at any events, but this will all be canceled, sadly enough for Tampa. But yeah, it's a roll of the dice. It's just 2020 all over, the way it is,
Pat, send some shrimp cocktail to my room when we were cooped up getting ready for the playoff game. But I was so sad early on in the game. The broadcast I watched, there was a Progressive commercial with Baker Mayfield, and Jedrick Wills was also in the commercial. I'm like, of course they're showing this. The game Wills has to sit out because he's sick. But Pat, we're almost 20 minutes into today's podcast, and yet another week we're talking about the struggles of kicker Cody Parkey and missing an extra point. And I thought that was a huge impact upon today's game because you go from what should have been 20-17 to 20-16 to where you then need a touchdown to go ahead and score instead of a field goal, which would have tied it. Now, the Jets got a field goal, which then extended their lead to 7 points. But this is not a trend I like to see with Cody Parkey, especially given his struggles as the Chicago Bears kicker 2 years ago, leading up to their playoff game too. But Cody Parkey hitting one off the upright. And I thought that kind of changed the momentum as the Browns were starting to seize the momentum of the game and they miss an extra point. It's like, well, now we have to get a touchdown to get the lead instead of being down 3 to where a field goal would tie it. But I hope that is not a trend for the Browns. I really hope it's not.
I hope it's not a trend. I mean, it absolutely changed the whole dynamic of the game. I mean, the team was coming back. Everything was going great. The field goal was there. I mean, we saw last night what happens, what a difference that can make at that 1 point. When Gruden decided not to go for the touchdown and instead accepted a field goal and then lost by, one good play, one lucky play, that kind of sealed the deal for them. I thought that was more or less a turning point for the team, for the game, that just put a kind of a speed bump in the way. I think mentally it let down a little bit. We didn't convert, we had punted after that. I mean, there was no more scores and not to put all the blame on Cody Parkey. I mean, there was a lot of times before that we should have moved down, but Parkey it's going to be a problem. If that happens at a bad time in a playoff game, next week, even against Pittsburgh, it changes the dynamic for Stefanski. Okay, we're at the 30-yard line. We're down by 3, 4th and 1. Do we go for it? Or do we go for the tie? So it's going to change everything. It changes Stefanski's strategies if he can't trust his kicker. And I think that the team, everybody on the team, I think it kind of changes their attitude towards that automaticness that they're looking for there.
100%. If there was a silver lining for the Browns today, I thought they did a nice job of getting the tight ends involved, something you knew that they would do going into the game, just because that has been a strength of this team, even when they're healthy. But Austin Hooper, 7 receptions for 71 yards. I know David Njoku had 4 receptions for 26 yards. And then I'm not sure. So I'm looking at Harrison Bryant had 3 receptions for 37 yards. So I thought that you knew going in that they were going to try to get the tight ends involved because they are familiar with this offense, having to elevate the receivers from the practice squad. You knew Baker was going to target them early and often, and then he did. And I think it was like his first 9 pass attempts. None of them went to receivers. And then he did get things going with Jamarcus Bradley. And so that's something I'm kind of curious to see is if it's just an exposure with the receivers, if they are due back in week 17 against the Steelers, do any of them actually come down with COVID-19? Because if they do, they would miss the week 17 matchup. So are you going to have to rely on a guy like a Jamarcus Bradley in a week 17? And so Bradley had 5 receptions for 60 yards. He was finally starting to get things going, but especially considering that the Browns couldn't really practice at all either, that's an awfully tough ask to try to get a rapport with Mayfield this late in the season as well. And look, I know that the Browns should have won today, but this is a Jets team that should actually have 3 wins and not 2, because remember the Hail Mary that the Raiders had a few weeks back, which got Jets defensive coordinator Greg Williams fired, the former Browns interim head coach and defensive coordinator. I think the Jets aren't as bad as the Jaguars, and that's why the Jaguars are going to get the number 1 overall pick. But again, I go back to the line of scrimmage told the story in this one, and that was evident, especially in the first half in this afternoon's game.
Yeah, that was impressive. The defensive line especially impressed me from the Jets because, I mean, Cleveland was hurting. I mean, we're missing the 2 big guys. You know, we had replacements in there. But they were missing Quinnen Williams. The Jets were missing their best pass rusher, the only guy with more than 2 sacks, the only guy with more than 10 hits. And they just came alive. I mean, they stepped up. In the absence of their best guy, everybody else in that line played out of their minds. And that was kind of what I expected from the offense of the Browns. Okay, we're missing a lot of guys. Everybody else needs to step up. That's why I was kind of disappointed in the Browns' effort today. Yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those. Just no way to explain it.
It's one of those things where, like Pat, if you would have told me that Andrew Sendejo was going to make a huge play in this one and that the Browns would lose, I would have been like, "What are you talking about?" Before this one.
I actually told my wife, I said, I hope Sendejo gets a turnover. They really needed a pick 6 at some point, and I thought it was going to be Sendejo just to make the whole season go away for him. But you were talking about the tight ends before. I actually found some fault in the way they were going after the tight ends. I thought Baker Mayfield was forcing it into Hooper too often too early. And I think that after a while, the Jets were just double teaming him, and he threw some passes when Hooper had bodies just hanging off him. And Hooper's not that kind of receiver. He was never that kind of receiver in Atlanta either. He doesn't win battles. He gets open. If he's not open, you can't jam it in there to him. And I thought I faulted Mayfield for that. I thought that they were really trying too hard, and he threw too many passes that, just really, there was very low percentile chances of him doing it. It was the Mayfield of last year at times. For a while last year, he led the league in tight throws, making tight throws, not completing them, but trying them. And that hurt his quarterback rating. And I saw the same thing today. Under pressure, he's a different quarterback. He was under pressure today. His stat for the year is under 50% completions, or right around 50% completions. Under pressure, over 70 without pressure. And, this is going to, that maybe not in Pittsburgh because they're going to be resting starters, but whoever we face in the playoffs, they're going to be blitzing the daylights out of this guy, just like teams used to do to Brady, because now he was exposed today. If he's under pressure, he just isn't making the big plays. He just didn't today. And he'll need to step it up. He'll need to learn how to do that. But I thought he jammed it into Hooper too often on a streak. Then he jammed it like 3 in a row to Njoku. Then he did a couple in a row to Bryant. And it was almost like he went in with a preconceived notion who he was going to throw to. And that was it. That was his only option. He didn't really seem to be reading down the field very well. And for most of the games, sometimes he.
Let me go to your point about Hooper. While Hooper had 7 receptions, he had 15 targets. And so that connection there, I hear what you're saying, but the only receiver he really targeted was Bradley, who had 11 targets. And then the only other receiver he targeted at all was Hall, and he only had 2 targets. And so trying to get the ball to the tight ends, you knew that was going to be the case. Try to get the ball out to the running backs in the screen pass game and everything. But again, I go back to, why is Baker Mayfield throwing the ball 53 times and you're only running the ball 18 times? And when the Browns did run the ball, they were not effective hardly at all. 18 carries for 45 yards in this one. And so there was another point I was going to make as well as we start to wrap up here on the Browns Nation station. But I hear what you're saying moving forward, and you hope, if you're a Browns fan, that the Steelers do rest their starters in week 17, just because if it is a straight up matchup, I do think it's a much different Steelers and Browns team than we saw earlier in the year in the blowout loss. But the Browns can make them life much, much easier if they win in week 17 versus if they lose, they're going to need a lot of help.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing too about this game too that stood out for me was the lack of use of Kareem Hunt. I don't know. I don't have the stats in front of me. I don't know how many targets he got.
He only had 4 carries. So yeah.
Yeah, he seemed invisible for most of the game. And I think he threw more passes to Chubb than he threw to Hunt today. And that to me, I expected Hunt to line up wide and really be a major part of the passing game. I was shocked that he was not targeted more.
Yes. So Hunt had 5 targets. Chubb had 5 targets. Hunt had 3 receptions for 41 yards. And then Chubb caught all 5 of his targets for 38 yards. And so you knew they'd have to try to get creative because, again, the receivers don't have the rapport or really just the NFL experience overall, let alone, any kind of rapport with Mayfield. And how could you really expect that? But again, I think that
5 targets each would be great in a normal game. But, today, given the situation, I think they would have done better going with Hunt than they were going with even with the tight ends,
Yes. And as we wrap up here, I thought the one thing Mayfield did is he at least did give the Browns a chance at the end. And I thought that was really important for this reason. The big question with the Browns is, what are you going to do with Baker Mayfield as your potential quarterback of the future? He's in year 3. He's under contract for 1 more year. Is the team going to pick up his 5th-year option for the 2022 season? This was the type of game where he at least had to give the Browns a chance to win, which he did up until the end, because if the Browns do pick up that 5th-year option, the 5th-year option will be between $25 and $26 million. But if they sign Mayfield to that huge contract extension, you're talking about paying him $100 million, maybe $100 million plus. And the Browns aren't going to have the same money to spend on other offensive players, whether that's the upgrades they made this offseason on the offensive line, whether it's having 2 beasts in the backfield and Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, whether it's the plethora of receivers with Jarvis and love him or hate him, OBJ, and having 3 tight ends with Njoku, Hooper, Bryant. Once the Browns allocate that kind of cap space to Mayfield, it's not going to be perfect. And this was an example of that today. It's an extreme example, missing your top 4 receivers, but I thought he at least gave the Browns a chance to win at the very end, even though he fumbled and did not execute down the stretch.
Yeah, Hunt, he came out at after halftime, and I actually thought to myself, this is it. This is his moment. This is going to prove or disprove everybody. This is going to decide all the headlines for the week. Okay. Does he come out and bounce around a little bit, start hitting passes? And he did. He came out. He got those 2 drives, 2 touchdowns. And I was like, all right, this is great. And then he hit a wall. And I think the Jets adjusted a little bit, took away some receivers. And that was it. But I think you're right. He did enough to warrant the extension. The Browns are pretty smart when it comes to money. And 2 things that are happening here. I think that if they sign Mayfield, I think you lose OBJ. I think that will determine OBJ's future because they won't be able to afford both of them. And I think that they'll have to save the money on their receivers, Landry and 4 young guys on cheaper contracts. And that may be enough with a decent tight end and Kareem Hunt in the fold. But the other thing that happened today was good news for everybody in the NFL, every GM, is that the league apparently, the decision isn't final, but I think it was Rappaport, reported that the league is expected to announce tomorrow a 17th regular season game for next year. And with the revenue from that game, it's expected that the salary cap will not go down as it was expected because of COVID. So that will give us a little more breathing room to pay Mayfield and somebody else. And that should help a bit. So those are 2 things. I think the plan will be that they're going to save money elsewhere and pay the man. I'm not sure it's 100% determined. I would guess they're going to take his 5th-year option and try to extend him during the year next year if he holds up. That's my guess.
I'm so happy you mentioned that, though, because from what I've heard, and I know other sports leagues have done this, to where they've borrowed against future earnings in subsequent seasons just because of the loss in revenue that you're going to have with fans that are normally at the stadium buying tickets, concessions, what have you, which impacts the revenue from what you'd see in a normal football season when we're not in a worldwide pandemic. I think your point about OBJ is spot on. I don't see, if you're going to keep Baker Mayfield, any world to where bringing OBJ back is beneficial to this Browns team because for whatever reason, and this is not knocking OBJ's ability as a receiver, but for whatever reason, Mayfield and this offense have been tenfold more effective with him not playing than him playing. So if I'm Andrew Berry in the front office, even if it's, say, a 4th round pick that you can get back for him, you try to get as much value back for him. But and that's harsh to say, but he just, for whatever reason, him and Baker Mayfield, it's been like oil and water.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I have my theories there. I think it's part of Mayfield's psyche also that he doesn't want to, not that he doesn't want another star on a team, but the thought that he has to feed another star, I think, put pressure on him as opposed to just finding an open guy and going with it. Landry is not like that. I mean, Landry had his moment. I remember once when he was complaining about no targets when he first got here, but for the most part, if it's only him and not OBJ, they'll come. So that won't be an issue. And,
I think Jarvis Landry's the Batman on this team deep down. And yeah. I don't know if OBJ is even Robin, but I think the fact that I was shocked that Landry hadn't missed a game in his 7-year career, which there's times where, especially early on in this year, you could criticize his play. The guy's playing with a cracked rib, and he's been a lot more effective the last few weeks. The weather's also been better. They had that 3-week stretch where it would be monsooning in Cleveland, and he's finally starting to come into his own and to play at the level that we expect, that Pro Bowl level receiver that we've seen from him year in and year out.
Yeah. I think the other thing, too, to remember about this whole thing, I mean, you're right about Landry. Landry is the guy, and he always has been, even when Odell was here. And I think really the only reason we didn't have more issues with Odell begging for the ball more was because he's good friends with Landry. So that kind of offsets some of what might have been, like, hey, I'm the star kind of guy. But the other thing, just I know we're going to close soon, just I wanted to mention, the thing that gives me a little bit of hope out of this, remember the Stefanski, we keep saying he's a genius and all. He's still a first-year coach. And this was a highly unusual week. And I trust him to learn a lot. So when we talk about how he's going to go forward, I mean, with a week to game plan, even if they lose all 4 receivers, which is highly unlikely for the next week, he'll learn from this. He'll figure out that maybe he over-adjusted here, maybe he under-adjusted there, maybe he should have trusted more in his players, and not tried to fix the issue himself, on paper. But I think that this was a learning experience for him. And again, I'll go back to 10-6, just inside or outside. I mean, 11-5 in is much better. I'd be much happier. And I think that's what's going to happen. Our prediction is we win next week, that Pittsburgh rests some players and we get by. And I think that one of the teams is going to lose next week and let us in there. But that's the way it is. Excuse me. Sorry. Excuse me.
You're fine. You're fine. And you'd have to imagine that the real beneficiary of today's game, the Jacksonville Jaguars, they secure the #1 overall pick and seem to have won the Trevor Lawrence sweepstakes. And so outside of Cleveland, that's going to be the storyline of this game, of the Jets somehow won again a week after beating the Los Angeles Rams. And so the Jags are in great position to get Trevor Lawrence playing up in Clemson, North Carolina. He'll come down to Jacksonville and hope to revitalize their franchise. I know the Jags have plenty of draft picks too, but with Cleveland, it might come down to that Week 17 matchup against your bitter AFC North foe in the Pittsburgh Steelers. And we've seen this time and time and time again. But I said this at the start of the year, and I'm going to say this again. I expect the Browns, the Steelers, and the Ravens, all 3 AFC North teams to get in. And we're set up to where that is the situation right now. Again, right now, the Browns inside the playoffs at the 7th seed at the time of this recording. So there still is hope despite the fact with today's loss. And you could see, they say the sideline tells the story. You could see the body language of Mayfield and a lot of the Browns players on the sideline after this one. But again, in a really tough situation, and hopefully they can learn from it and regroup in Week 17 against the Steelers.
Yeah, this is going to hurt, but a victory over the Steelers, cures a lot of ills, and I think that'll be fine. I know it's interesting, too. I'm sorry. You were talking about the Jets. It was interesting there for a while because before the game, I learned that the Jets can win out. And even if they win out, they can't do any worse than the 2nd overall pick. There's no scenario where they were costing themselves any more positions in there. But at halftime, Jacksonville was tied 10-10. with Chicago, and it looked like they might take that game. And I don't know what happened in Jacksonville, but every time I looked at the TV after in the second half, it was 17-10, 24-10, 27-10, 30. It was just amazing. They got crushed. But for a while there, it looked like Jacksonville might win this week also. And I was wondering if anybody was going to tell Adam Gase that and tell him, okay, cool it, back in the running, but it didn't happen. Oh, well.
Pat, any final thoughts before we sign off here on the Browns Nation station?
No, it's a very disappointing week, but nobody should be jumping off bridges or anything for us. I mean, we're going to be fine. I think that if we win, we're in. We still control our destiny. I really think Baker will come back. I mean, I've not been the biggest Baker fan, but I do believe that he's going to come back next week. I think Stefanski will come in with a great game plan. We're going to have a lot of bodies back on the field, and we're going to roll into the playoffs. I think we have to take on probably Buffalo if we go in as the 7th seed. A little bit different than what we expected, but hey, it'd be quite a scenario. Cleveland and Buffalo in the playoffs in the same year against each other.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to see what that line is against the Steelers. And then if the Browns do make it in, be in the playoffs for the first time since the 2002 season, the other team with the longest active drought in the NFL was the Bucs. They've last made it in 2007. They're in. And so if the Browns get in as well, you would have the two teams with the longest active playoff droughts making it in 2020, which just adds to all of the craziness that we've seen this year, even outside of football. And I would certainly expect the Browns to play the Steelers a lot closer. In week 6, the Steelers won 38-7. This is a much different Steelers team, a lot of injuries, and a Steelers team that has struggled from an offensive standpoint and struggled to run the ball, which is the Browns' strength. So you get some of the line back, maybe you get Wyatt Teller back, a lot of the receivers back, and you're talking about a different scenario. And so, Pat, appreciate you filling in on the Browns Nation station. This has been a lot of fun. Love to hear back from fans too. So leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, what have you. If you're watching on YouTube too, drop us a comment. Even if you disagree with something we said, we love to go back and forth and interact with our listeners as well. But the Browns, a 23-16 loser to the Jets in week 16, and we'll see what happens in week 17 against the Steelers. I'll go ahead and sign off here for Pat Opperman, and I'm Mark Bergin. Thank you for listening to the Browns Nation station. We'll see you next week. Take care, and so long, everyone.